وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على. أما بعد السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. So the paper that I will be presenting is some of the thoughts that are coming out in my book with Brill on the history and philosophy of Shi'i devotional literature. Hopefully this year it will be announced. It's just going through the last stages of review, which was initially based on my dissertation, now thoroughly revised. But the objective of this talk here is to explore the lacuna that is the study of Islamic and specifically Shi'i devotional literature. And in doing so, I'll attempt to address the following questions, which is number one, what is meant by devotional literature and where are these texts to be found? And why have I chosen to emphasize on Shi'i texts and what are some elements that make it unique within the broader Islamic tradition? Lastly, what methods or typological frameworks can we adopt when conducting a textual study of this corpus of liturgical literature? And the answer to the latter can certainly be informed by reference to the voluminous academic studies in the field of Christian devotional theology and the textual study of the Psalms and the study of biblical prayer. So what I'm essentially saying is that the study of Shi'i devotional literature within an academic context, by academic I mean within a kind of universal context, not where we're interacting with scholars of other traditions, can without doubt be put into conversation with the existing work on the Psalms and biblical prayers within the academy. And it's my intention to place the study of Islamic devotional literature in conversation with Christian and Jewish studies in the field of liturgy and devotional literature. And this is something I hope is one of the contributions of my research in this, and I'm actually teaching a graduate seminar for master's and PhD students this year at St. Michael's College on this subject. So it's really exciting. I get to, and it's always the best when your students help you form your ideas. Graduate seminars are always useful for that, right? So obviously you offer a course. That's what profs you often do, right? They offer courses based on their interests, and then the students will bring new ideas, and you reform your own ideas and restructure them by listening to what your graduate students have to offer. So this is really exciting and something that I'm learning a lot about. And I wanted to open with an observation from the late Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the famous religionist who was the chair of McGill for many years, Islamic Studies and Religion. In 1962, he said, "I remember in India some years ago when my wife and I were one summer at a mountain resort in the Himalayas, and we were out for a hike in the hills, and we came upon a work gang busy in the construction of a mountain road. It was, of course, all hand labor, and they had crushed the stones with hammers and were now rolling them with a large and very heavy roller, rather in the fashion like sailors who were as if they were working at sea. They were rhythmically pulling this heavy roller in spurts of concerted effort. The foreman would sing out, 'La ilaha illallah,' there's no God but God. And the rest of the gang would put their shoulders to the ropes with heaves, and they would respond, 'Muhammad Rasulullah.' And this went on and on as they continued to work. With a will and with good strong heaves, they continued to chant, 'La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah.' And every time they would chant, 'La ilaha illallah,' the other group that's working would respond with, 'Muhammad Rasulullah.' Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And what this tells us is that this scene represents a course of a kind of living in which a split into religious and secular in some ways has not yet come, or this so-called split between sacred and profane. And this is what prayer does. This is devotional life inspires this kind of life. And these prayers, chants, and incantation represent the break of the divine into the mundane, which represents the very longing and aspirations of the inner life of both religious individuals and communities. When such prayers are uttered or believed to have originated from the ecstatic moments of saints or awliya or ma'sumin, They in turn become sacred literature. Such utterances, when repeated as liturgical script by the devout, tethers them to that sacred past, initiating the supplicant into a meta-historical communion, meaning into like this moment outside of the realm of time, with the saint, or the wali, or the imam, or the prophet, who becomes the indispensable portal to the otherwise unknowable God, who becomes in that moment imminent. In that moment of that desperate cry, God becomes close to that person, and the portal, or the means by which God becomes close to them, or the imminence of God in that very moment, is through that sacred figure who's taught that prayer. So clearly, this is not something unique to Shi'ism. Rather, such prayers reflect a concern with what is known as individual eschatology, which formed a unique aspect of communitarian religions of the book, which marked a decisive transformation in late antique religiosity. Individual eschatology, meaning each and every person is responsible for their judgment before God. So now they want to figure out, how are they going to deal with this journey? How are they going to deal with this very personal individual judgment before one God? How are they going to negotiate this? Right? And prayers, and these devotional prayers and these contemplative prayers would play and do play an indispensable role in shaping that process and that concern with individual eschatology. As they formed and transformed through late antiquity, these religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and finally Islam, had two unique overarching concerns. Firstly, there was a new attention given to an eternal self, the soul, which requires reform and spiritual development to draw closer to God. Secondly, this unseen self must prepare for final judgment, and thus must do all it can to attain eternal paradise and avoid eternal damnation. The teleological underpinnings of prayer for religions of the book enhance one's relationship with a God that is worthy of worship, and the one entity that can save the believers from their unruly selves, as well as provide the consolation of an eventual deliverance in this world and the next. The development of private prayer and its associated liturgy, detached from animal sacrifice, becomes the nexus of expressing this teleology, meaning this end point, meaning a teleology, meaning what is the direction of what you're doing, right? They're doing this ultimately to arrive at what? The pleasure of God. Day of judgment, right? That's the telos, it's the direction, it's the, I don't want to use, it's not obviously a religious studies department or a philosophy department, so I don't want to use words that, I want to explain the words that I'm using. But this is very, very fundamental. And this was really, I would say, one of the unique contributions in some senses of the religions of the book, of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Because prior to that, as Sarah Stromsa points out in a fascinating book called The End of Sacrifice, she says, mentions something interesting, which is there was a shift from animal sacrifice, that people felt that they would, that one of the ways to please God was to sacrifice an animal in the temple, right? That you sacrifice an animal, and this was a way of kind of releasing oneself, a way of, a kind of penance, right? And it's not to say that animal sacrifice went away, but then there was this shift, especially through this focus on monotheism, to the individual self, self-contemplation, to self-introspection. And this is where prayer and devotion would be absolutely indispensable. To live a prayerful life, a life which is imbued and filled with prayer and devotion, was absolutely fundamental. And it is my further assertion that a similar characterization can be made of Shi'i liturgy insofar as worship and devotion provide the primary experience of God and the Imams for the devout who do not spend their life immersed in the specialized study of Islamic texts. For Shi'i Muslims, the devotional acts can be split into two paths, generally speaking, those directed to God and those directed to the infallibles. And it is believed then, by them, that this search for holiness is inextricably linked to to these 14 saintly personalities. So their search for holiness, their search for meaning, their search for the sacred is indispensably linked to these 14 infallible personalities. Thus, for us, for Shi'is, these acts of devotional prayer, whether they be petitions to God or exaltations of the Imams, Ziyārat, could be described as sacred lessons in devotional theology, in which the infallibles of Imami Shi'ism taught the seekers how to express their deepest feelings. They taught them how to find words for the dialectic of the embattled self. That is, this person within us, this voice within us that is often conflicted, confused, estranged, finding in moments of anxiety, moments of happiness, moments of sadness, moments of confusion, moments of doubt. And it was only these 14 infallibles that could impart to them a way by which they could understand themselves. And they gave them two principal ways by which they could do this: praying to God and devotion to their teachers. These are the two paths. Ziyārat is a manifestation of devotion to those who impart it to them, who impart to us those sacred teachings. And the first part, obviously, is prayer to God. And these two were never seen as contradictions to each other. And in a broad sense, both dua and ziyarah are reflective of a conscientious attempt to acculturate the Shi'i community to Islamic ideals such as aqidah and tarbiyah, which is belief and pietistic discipline. This is how Frederick Heiler, in his very famous book on prayer, written, I think it's in the 60s or the 50s, maybe even earlier, he described the pivotal role played by Augustine, famous writer of the Confessions, right? Augustine, the Christian saint, lived before the prophet's time. That the pivotal role played by Augustine's understanding of prayer, which may be analogous to how the infallibles or saints of Shi'ism propounded prayer to the seeker of spiritual enlightenment in their midst. For Heiler, it was Augustine who in prayer masterfully combined the passion of the Psalms' lament over the self with the Neoplatonic contemplative mysticism, which then brought together best expressing a deep dialectic of the self that contends with both of these realities while returning to the infinite one, which is God. In this case, for Shi'is, the Imam would not be compared to Augustine. The Imam would be compared to Moses, to David, to Jesus, to Mary. Sayyid Zahra in the case of Maryam. And my second course, which is being offered in the winter this year, will do just that. We'll put the second course, the second graduate seminar, is on the construction and concept of holiness in Islam, and how these personalities are both perceived and assembled in the literature. I don't mean by fabricated, but I mean something has to be written in a way that it's presented. And we look at the archetypes and the typologies or the patterns that are found in this and compare it to certain biblical personalities. So for example, I have like 2 weeks just on Sayyidah Zahra and Sayyidah Maryam, and comparing the two personalities. And what I'm trying to say here, and in my further research, is that in their prayers there is an important comparison that can be made and must be made. And this is one of the probably the reasons why the Sahīfa Sajadiyya is called Injil Ali Muhammad, the Bible of Ali Muhammad, Zabur Ali Muhammad. Why are these names given? These names are not coming from the Imams. Probably by the time of Ibn Shahrashub, the 6th century Hijrah. But why did the ulama give these names? Maybe it's from the Imams. It's debated. But I think these were more later attributions. And there's nothing wrong with this. But why? Why not just call Sahīfa al-Kamila? Even in fact, in some of the earliest manuscripts, we see, like early manuscripts, I mean like from like the year 600, 700, so on and so forth, and later you see, instead of saying Sahīfa, it just says Zabur Ali Muhammad, the Psalms of the family of the Prophet, which is of course a reference to the compilation of du'as of Imams al-Abidin, which is known as Sahīfa Sajadiyya. Because there was this idea that a comparison could be drawn between the two in their sacredness, in their importance, in their holiness, and in the fact that they are both important repositories of devotional literature that require commentary and further understanding. And just like that, there is an entire genre of literature of commentaries, marginalia, hashia, on the Psalms, which are the prayers ascribed to David, right? I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of volumes and books written on when would have Nabi Dawood recited this prayer? When would he have said this prayer? He had met these people at this time, and then he said this prayer. There's a whole commentary tradition. Likewise, there's a commentary tradition on the Sahīfa, right? The two are in parallel. Of course, one is ancient, much more ancient than, obviously, way before the time of Imams and Abidin. But the other rhetorical importance of drawing this, especially and this is done by Imami scholars themselves, 12 or Shi'i scholars themselves, another rhetorical reason for using this word Psalms or Bible with regards to the Sahīfa or the Ad'iyah or supplications of Imams and Abidin is to also connect them in terms, as I mentioned, of their holiness and sacredness. Right? That the Imams' supplications are no different in their sacredness and profundity than that of the kalam of a prophet. So in one sense, they're a kind of divine inspiration, ilham. They're from God, actually. The Imam is just a receptacle that's imparting to people the words that God has inspired to him. Because that's what's believed about David. God inspired him when he was in moments of darkness and moments of sadness and moments of difficulty and on and on and on, right? And the prophet found hope, found strength in those moments. So this rhetorical comparison is very important. And this is where I think a lot of work can be done between studying the Sahīfa, Sajadiyya, and the Psalms. Now, in terms of the early Shi'i literature, I have a lot written here, and I don't think I'm going to get through all of this, but the corpus is early. There is no doubt that the corpus is early. I've spent the better part of 10 years on it. Like I said, I have a 400-page book coming out on this subject. So yeah, I really geeked out on this subject, like totally. It's early. The literature is early. We know that the companions of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt had many books of dua, many books of Ziyārah. Do they exist today? No, they don't. But then most of these books from that time don't exist. But we have references to them. And later scholars like Sheikh Tusi, who lived in the 5th century, or even earlier people like Mufid and Kulaini, right, from the 3rd to the 5th century Hijrah, reference these texts from the time of the Imams when transmitting supplications. Dua al-Iftitah is an example, for example. This comes from a notebook which was preserved by Muhammad bin Uthman. We know this, right? This supplication was taught by Muhammad bin Uthman. It was kept in a written notebook. We have many, many, many examples of this. I discuss it in the book at length, of these notebooks of dua. We have this at the time of Imam al-Kadhim. We have this at the time of the 11th Imam. In fact, we have another example of what to recite in the qunut, for example, right? So did you know that there's a qunut associated with each Imam? Although we're missing the one from Amir al-Mu'mineen. We only have it from Imam al-Hasan to Sahib al-Zaman. And every qunut is very particular to each Imam. And how do we know this? Does someone just make this up in the Safwid period? Majlisi or someone has an often accusation is Majlisi just saw something in a dream and decided to teach us to pray? No. We have a manuscript from the 6th century in Mosul, Musnad, going back to the 11th Imam, in which a group of companions came to visit the 11th Imam. Or rather, came to visit the first Safir in Samarra, who said, I command you to record these prayers that our forefathers have kept, meaning the 11th Imam and his forefathers, have kept these prayers in a notebook. And then the companions would proceed to copy them by hand and then impart them to others. This was a role played by Hussein ibn Ru, Uthman bin Sa'id, Muhammad bin Uthman, Samari, all of them. They had notebooks of these prayers. No, they're not just concocted at some point. But do we have the originals? No, we don't. No, we don't have the originals, but we have manuscripts from the 5th century, the 6th century, which are found, interestingly, in Mosul, in Basra, in Karbala, in different places, where we have, for example, like the signature of Ibn Idris al-Hili on it, saying that, we have this manuscript, it's musnad, this is a sanad going back to the imam, so do these du'as on this day, recite this qunut on this day, dua al-iftita on this day. For example, the whole amal of the day of Ashura, pretty much, most of it. Is it made up? People say, oh, where is this coming from? Oh, it's from Kulaini. With ijazas and permission to transmit the amal from each scholar going back to Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam. This is something that the ulama themselves were performing. Ziyārah Ashura, walking back and forth, it is there. It's not just ritual. This is sacred devotions that the Imams have taught in order for their Shi'a and their followers to be initiated into the sacred realm, to understand God. Because they can't understand God without the one whom God has inspired. It's like journeying, without a captain. So this literature is profound, it's old, but yes, we don't have contemporaneous documents. So for the critical skeptic, this is problematic. Yes, I do admit that. I'm not saying that we have things from the time of the Imams. We don't. We have references to it. Now the question is, are those references correct or not? Or are they made up or not? I think that they're so voluminous. There's so many of them. We can trace it back to the time of Kulaini. I think these books did exist, unless all these indices were completely fabricated. They were all like Tusi would just sit, Najashi would sit and make up the whole thing. And even make up all his chains of transmission, let's say going to Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman, Fadl ibn Sha'ban, all of them who had books of dua and ziyarat. I don't know. I don't think so. You'd have to argue the reverse, that it's all invented. You have to argue the reverse. And unfortunately today, we just have a lot of people that don't know anything about this literature and make a lot of comments about things that they're not experts in. And I remember my teacher, the late Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussain al-Husayni al-Jalali, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, who I had the opportunity to study hadith with for 7 years. And when I told him I want to work on this subject, he began guiding me, and he told me that the late Mar'ashi Najafi, the famous Ayatollah Mar'ashi, was really interested in this subject. And he, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, Sayyid al-Jalali, encouraged me to walk on this path and to study it more, and he initiated me into his tradition, which was taught to him by Al-Bazurg and Sayyid Mar'ashi, which was taught to them obviously by Abbas al-Qummi and Mirza Nouri, and going back and back and back and back and back, right? For these du'as and ziyarat and the study of them. So I wanted to share with you just something interesting and then conclude. I have no idea when I started or when I ended, so I'm just going to end now. something really interesting going on here, and maybe you'll have questions after because it's a little bit like, oh, okay, interesting. Okay. Majlisi al-Awwal, so the father of Muhammad Baqir. Muhammad Baqir is the compiler of Bihar al-Anwar, right? So Majlisi al-Awwal is Muhammad Taqi al-Majlisi, his father, the writer of Rawdat al-Muttaqin, the commentary of Manahi Dhurul al-Faqih, and many, many, many other books. Here's an ijaza fi nihayat al-Nusqa. So ijaza to one of his students, Muhammad Sadiq al-Kirbasi al-Isfahani al-Hamadani, or Hamadani. I think it's Hamadani. It's not correct. Yeah, it's Hamadani, not Hamadani. And this is his permission. So, for example, when someone wants to transmit a hadith, you have to have permission to do this. You can't just go around. That's why I'm saying anyone coming on the minbar saying Qala Rasulullah, on what authority? Anyways, that's something else. Sayyid Jalal used to get really angry about this. Anyways, people talk about Kalam Ahlul Bayt, they don't know what they're talking about. Anyhow, so, because you need an authority. From which teacher did you learn hadith from? Like, what gives you the authority to speak on behalf of the Prophet? So here, Majlisi has a special permission that he's given to his student to teach or transmit the Sahīfa of Imam Zain al-Abidin. But look at what he says. This is really interesting. He says here, I won't go through the whole thing. You know how long the ijazah? There's 200 and, well, I don't know if there's 200 in this one. Yeah, somewhere about 300 different links in the chain. Yeah, 300. So that's a lot of people transmitting the Sahīfa. Abtahi, Mawahid Abtahi does the same thing, presents this in his book as well. Anyway, so he says here, بلغ المولى الجليل والفاضل النبي الجامع العقول والمنقول حاوي الفروع والأصول مولانا محمد صادق. So here he's addressing his student here. تأييداته بقراءتي عليه في مجالس وأجزت له أن يروي عني زبور آل محمد. So he's saying here that that I read it aloud, that we had these sessions, and now I'm giving him a license, ajaztu. I'm giving him a license to transmit from me Zabur Ali Muhammad. Right? Okay. Injil Ahlul Bayt wa Du'a al-Kamil. So these are all the names for Sahīfa Sajjadiyah. This is very interesting. For the Sahīfa that we're reciting. Mind it, there's differences in how many du'as are in it. I don't want to get into that. This is another whole different kettle of fish in Pandora's box. But nevertheless, the one we have today is pretty close. وإنجيل أهل البيت ودعاء الكامل. These are all the names. So the Injil of the Ahlul Bayt, ودعاء الكامل. So that's another title he's given for it. These are different names for the same book. Or whether it's called Sahīfa itself, we're not even, there's so many names. In the early manuscripts, it doesn't even say Sahīfa. It says Du'a al-Kamil, for example, right? These names were probably, developed at a later date. Was Sahīfa al-Kamila, and the complete scroll. بأسانيدي المتواترة إلى سيد الأجل شيخ الطائفة. With my chains of transmission that are mutawatir, that are so plenty, going to Sheikh Tusi, the founder of the House of Najaf, the one that Moana was referring to, Najaf, right? The founder of the House of Najaf. And then from Tusi, there are chains of transmission going back to the Imam. علاها مناولة عن خليفة الرحمن في الرؤية, of which I received, was given to me from the Imam of the time in a vision. And then he goes on to the whole story. So the Imam of the time seems to be also playing a role in this as well. And we find this all over the literature with regards to Sahīfa. That's fascinating. We find it all over the literature. And this is one of the things I'm discussing is what's the role of the 12th Imam, at least envisioned by the great fuqaha, in the preservation of this book. This is Majlisi al-Awwal's words. And he says this in other places as well. If you go to the book on Ijazat in Bihar, you'll see this in other places as well. So he has his isnads, the ones that are written, but then he has also this unseen tradition that he's receiving through vision, ru'ya, from the Imam of the time, at least as he claims. So I thought I would just leave that with you there a little bit. وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَى سَيِّدِنَا مُحَمَّدٍ وَآلِهِ الطَّيِّبِينَ الطَّاهِرِينَ.